Hamburger Hill is an unofficial name given by American soldiers and the media to the battle on Hill 937, named for its height of 937 meters above sea level. The Hamburger Hill battle took place over 10 days from May 10, 1969, to May 20, 1969. The photo shows the location of Hill 937 marked in red on the map. This hill is situated to the south of the A Sao A Luoi Valley, referred to as A Shao by Americans, and is approximately 70 kilometers southwest of Hue. The purpose of the American forces' high-intensity attack is to sever the supply line along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This marks Phase 2 of Operation Apache Snow, a campaign consisting of 3 phases aimed at destroying the Viet Cong forces in the A Shao Valley, a crucial link in the logistical chain supporting South Vietnam. In 1966, the Viet Cong successfully captured a U.S. base in the A Shao Valley and established a presence there. Subsequent U.S. efforts to retake the valley were unsuccessful. Major General Richard G. Stilwell, commander of the U.S. 24th Division, decided to deploy forces equivalent to 2 divisions, heavily supported by artillery and air power, to accomplish the mission. The forces engaged at Hill 937 included 3 battalions from the 101st Airborne Division, commanded by Major General Melvin Zay. These battalions were all part of the 3rd Brigade, commanded by Colonel Joseph Conmee, and comprised the 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry, Lieutenant Colonel Weldon Honeycomb, the 2nd Battalion, 501st Infantry, Lieutenant Colonel Robert German, and the 1st Battalion, 506th Infantry, Lieutenant Colonel John Bowers. The 2nd Battalion, 1st Regiment, and the 4th Battalion, 1st Regiment from the Army of the Republic of Vietnam's 1st Division were assigned to support the 3rd Brigade. Other units participating in the campaign included the 9th Marine Regiment, the 3rd Squadron of the 5th Cavalry Regiment of the United States Army, and the 3rd Regiment of the 1st Division of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. On the side of the Vietnam Liberation Army, the combat force is the 3rd Battalion commanded by Battalion Commander Ma Vinh Lan. It comprises 3 companies, Company 7, Company 8, and Company 9 serving as reserves alongside guerrilla forces in the Luoi district. The 3rd Battalion has assigned Company 8 to be reinforced with an additional 82mm mortar platoon, a 12.7mm anti-aircraft gun platoon for mountain tunneling, and the construction of a hidden bunker at the high point 937 in the Bia Mountain. The mobile attack combined with blocking plan is suitable for the practical battlefield situation, both actively engaging the enemy and minimizing losses. Company 7 is tasked with blocking and securing high points 916 and 903. The battalion will employ the tactic of mobile attack combined with blocking, deploying platoons and companies for short-range raids and ambushes on each cluster of U.S. troops stationed in the outskirts. Depending on the specific situation, the battalion is preparing a plan for a mobile attack combined with blocking at the battalion level to eliminate the U.S. companies. To achieve this goal, the battalion must establish a series of blocking points to attract U.S. troops deeper, creating opportunities and conditions for mobile units to advance and destroy the enemy's outskirts and reinforcement troops. At 3 p.m. on May 8, the units began their march to occupy the battlefield. Company 8 was reinforced with the 14th Platoon of 82mm mortars to establish blocking points at Abia. Company 7 was positioned in the areas of high points 903 and 916. The 16th Mobile Company moved along the western section of Highway 14 from Asao to Luoi. The remaining firepower was directly controlled by the battalion. Company 9 served as reserves, with the immediate task of transporting rice and ammunition from Abang to Luoi. Scout soldiers closely monitored each advancing column of U.S. troops. At 10:15 on May 10, Battalion 8, led by Battalion Commander Din Xuan Bai, launched an attack on a company from the 3rd Battalion, U.S. paratroopers, located on hills 400 and 500, approximately 2 kilometers northeast. After secretly approaching the target, at the designated time, Squad 10 eliminated 1 U.S. squad and then advanced down to the saddle, coordinating with Platoon 3 to strike upwards. Simultaneously on Hill 500, Squad 9 advanced to the summit but hit 2 preset U.S. Claymore mines, causing nearly complete casualties. The group advancing from the saddle upwards was also shot at by U.S. troops from the hilltop, halting the advance in that direction. Company 5 had to use the 82mm mortar and B-40 rockets from Hill 400 to provide support but was still unable to achieve a decisive result. U.S. artillery relentlessly shelled Hill 400, combined with 2 helicopters skimming the treetops, strafing with machine guns and dropping grenades around Hill 500. Facing this situation, Battalion 8 ordered Company 5 to withdraw to Abia to continue building a fortified position. The battle lasted less than an hour, resulting in dozens of U.S. soldiers killed. Battalion 8 of the Southern Liberation Army, due to dispersing their forces and not concentrating on the main objective of the U.S. command post, allowed the U.S. forces to organize resistance, causing significant losses. In the direction of Battalion 7, from the first moments, the battalion command focused fire support for Company 1 to attack Hill 903. After dozens of U.S. soldiers were killed, the U.S. brought in 6 helicopters for reinforcement and evacuated 2 companies to the south. Recognizing they had encountered main force units, the U.S. intensified their attacks and used armed helicopters to take turns reconnoitering the battle area. On May 11, Hunnicutt ordered Companies Alpha and Delta to scout the north and northwest of Abia Mountain, while Companies Bravo and Charlie reinforced other routes. At 1 p.m. on May 11, the U.S. landed 2 battalions on Hills 903, 916, and Abia. On the Southern Liberation Army side, the regiment commander ordered Battalion 7 to station 1 company in the area of Hills 903 and 916, while 3 companies remained mobile, closely following and attacking the U.S. When moving out to the helicopter landing zone on the northern slope, Company Bravo engaged in fierce fighting with the Southern Liberation Army forces within 1 kilometer by the end of the day. Hunnicutt quickly directed all 1 Cobra gunship helicopters, equipped with rockets and heavy machine guns, to support a hasty assault. In the dense jungle, the Cobras mistakenly attacked the U.S. 187th Battalion as a Southern Liberation Army unit, killing 2 and wounding 35, including Hunnicutt. This friendly fire incident disrupted the formation and command, forcing the 187th Battalion to withdraw into a defensive position for the night. However, communication confirmed that a significant Southern Liberation Army force was present, leading Hunnicutt to estimate the need for reinforcing with a platoon or company. Also on the night of May 11, a Special Operations Battalion from the military region attacked the headquarters of the U.S. 3rd Paratrooper Brigade at Dong Tran Base. On the morning of May 12, the U.S. had to redeploy the 506th Battalion from Alathim to protect the brigade headquarters. With the U.S. 2nd Battalion withdrawn to Dong Tran, there were no longer any U.S. forces holding positions north of Abia. The command of the 3rd Regiment of the Southern Liberation Army decided to move Battalion 9, commanded by Battalion Commander Vaughn, from the Lam Sun tunnels to the Bao area. Battalion 8 continued to consolidate its fortified positions. During these 2 days, Hunnicutt maneuvered his companies into positions for a coordinated attack on May 13 but was frustrated by the difficult terrain and the Southern Liberation Army's resistance. A unit of Company Delta, falling into a steep, muddy ravine on May 12, suffered very high casualties over the next 2 days. At noon on May 13, Brigade Commander of the Airborne Brigade, Colonel Conmi, decided to cut off the reinforcements of the People's Liberation Armed Forces from Laos and support Hunnicutt by attacking Abia from the south. Bravo Company was helicoptered to Hill 916, but the rest of the battalion moved on foot from an area 4 kilometers from Hill 937, and both Conmi and Hunnicutt expected the 506th Battalion to be ready to provide support no later than the morning of May 15. Although Bravo Company reached Hill 916 on May 15, it did not join the attack until May 19 due to the almost impassable jungle. At 12 noon on May 13, a company of the People's Liberation Armed Forces spotted a group of American soldiers in a bomb crater under the saddle, using binoculars to observe the summit of Abia. 20 minutes later, more American soldiers emerged from under the saddle. Waiting for the Americans to climb out of the bomb crater, The People's Liberation Armed Forces used anti-personnel mines along with infantry to attack the leading group, with an 82mm mortar battery covering the rear. The American soldiers fled down the hillside. Company 1 of the 501st Battalion was annihilated. The Americans used helicopters to deploy 2 other companies at the base of Abia to recover their fallen comrades, but darkness forced them to return to their original positions. After the Battle of Company 6 at Abia, the combat plan was confirmed. The Americans continued to counterattack Abia and the high points 903 and 916. The command of the People's Liberation Armed Forces decided to keep Battalion 8 at Abia and Battalion 7 at high point 903, deploying Battalion 9 to operate in a Lathim and a Lilot, while using sappers to continuously attack the American positions. Following the regiment's directive, on the night of May 13 and early morning of May 14, Company 20 sappers attacked the command post of the 1506th Battalion at high point 1078, destroying the 105mm artillery positions. On May 13, the 3rd Airborne Brigade organized counterattacks on the high points 903 and 916. Battalion 7, commanded by Battalion Commander Tang Ban Mu and Political Commissar Tran Trian, used interlocking positions to keep the American soldiers constantly moving, calling for artillery support to create a fire belt around their positions. On May 14, a 12-gun fire unit including B-40, B-41, 82mm mortars, and 60mm mortars of the People's Liberation Armed Forces suddenly attacked an American company 2 kilometers east of high point 916. After 2 days of continuous bombing and shelling on May 13 and 14, the Americans used the 1506th Battalion to launch a 2-pronged attack on Abia. In the southeast, the counterattack of 2 American companies was also pinned down by Company 6 of the People's Liberation Armed Forces with minefields and mortar fire under the saddle. When the Americans managed to climb the saddle and approach the summit, they were ambushed by the infantry of the People's Liberation Armed Forces. Being attacked closely and unexpectedly, the American soldiers retreated down the slope, calling for artillery support. Knowing that the 3rd Airborne Brigade was concentrating efforts to capture Abia, from May 15 onwards, Battalion 8 took advantage of the time between counterattacks to dig trenches and develop positions on the northwest slope of Abia to avoid American artillery from the northeast. The trenches were built half above and half below ground, with multiple levels and layers for sleeping and fighting. The regiment's headquarters and subordinate units took turns going to Abia to help Battalion 8 build the trenches. With this fortification system, Battalion 8 sheltered in the ground, avoiding the relentless American bombardment day and night, organizing counterattacks against dozens of American assaults. The Americans, supported by napalm bombs, flamethrowers, and recoilless rifles, advanced very slowly, paying a heavy price for each captured position. The units of the People's Liberation Armed Forces also attacked American helicopter landing zones, damaging or shooting down many helicopters despite having only light weapons and grenade launchers. After being stalled for 3 days, the Americans changed tactics. They used intense artillery fire on the entrenched positions while sending company-sized units to attack high points 916 and 900, aiming to isolate Battalion 8 and then use larger forces to capture Abia. At noon on May 15, the Americans helicoptered in a company, Bravo Company, from the 1506th Battalion to high point 916 while deploying 2 battalions towards high point 900 to gradually advance towards Abia, coordinating with the 501st Battalion to organize counterattacks. Both sides fought fiercely for 2 days. The Americans rotated their forces 3 times, and the People's Liberation Armed Forces gradually ran out of men, trenches collapsed, and could not be reinforced in time. Battalion 8's positions were gradually lost, especially those of Company 8. However, the People's Liberation Armed Forces still held Abia. Battalion 8 was cut off from the regiment's main formation. The battalion command decided to let Company 6 continue to fortify and fight the enemy from the north. Company 7 was pulled back to reinforce the position at high point 991. Company 5 was sent to reinforce Company 8, and the remaining forces served as reserves. The battalion also reported to the regiment, "The situation is difficult, the wounded cannot be evacuated, we are short of ammunition, and have no mobile forces." We can only hold out until the morning of May 17. Retreat route is south of Abia. The 3rd Airborne Brigade was tactically outmaneuvered, switching from proactive search and destroy missions to capturing targets as intended by the People's Liberation Armed Forces. The regiment's command ordered Battalion 8 to continue holding Abia to draw in the enemy, creating conditions for Battalions 7 and 9 and the artillery companies to maneuver south of Abia to attack the American flanks. The immediate objective was to dislodge the American company from High Point 916 to re-establish a continuous defensive line for the regiment. On May 16 and 17, many battles occurred around Hills 903, 916, and south of Abia. On May 16, the regiment concentrated 16 mortars, B-40s, B-41s, and 12.7 mm machine guns to suddenly attack an American company at Dong Chuoi. At 9 a.m. on May 17, Company 2 of Battalion 7 launched a surprise attack on an American company at High Point 916, driving the Americans from Position 1. The Americans abandoned Position 2 and fled down the slope, running into Company 5's position. By 2 p.m. on May 17, many American soldiers at 916 had been killed. The corridor between 916 and Abia was cleared, reopening the route to Battalion 8. The 3rd Airborne Brigade Command was unaware of the fate of the American company on High Point 916, so they continued helicoptering reinforcements, only for Company 2 to shoot down 2 helicopters and the soldiers aboard. During this period, intense fighting also occurred at Abia. The Americans were determined to capture Abia to save face and recover their fallen comrades over the past 2 days. After isolating Battalion 8 from Regiment 3, the 3rd Airborne Brigade, along with the 2, 501st Battalion and 2 companies of the 1,506th Battalion, surrounded Abia, taking turns counter-attacking. The Americans abandoned the overwhelming wave tactic and instead used continuous waves to create tension, hoping to exhaust the People's Liberation Armed Forces and force them to abandon Abia. On May 16 and 17, American artillery along Route 12 fired continuously at Abia, even using chemical shells causing tear gas effects. The final counterattack on May 17 occurred at 3 p.m. The Americans divided into 4 groups, using chemical shells to attack Abia. By 4 p.m., one American company, supported by air and artillery, attacked the positions. While the Americans focused on the positions of Companies 5 and 6, Company 2 of Battalion 7 unexpectedly attacked the left flank of an American company's formation, pushing them down the slope. The final American counterattack on Abia on May 17 failed. Stalled for 5 days, American commanders ordered a coordinated attack by 2 battalions on May 18, with the 1,506th Battalion attacking from the south and the 3,187th Battalion from the north, attempting to isolate the enemy forces. Delta Company of the 3,187th Battalion was airlifted near the hill but suffered severe losses from ambushes, including all its officers. From an observation helicopter, the battalion commander tried to coordinate the remaining companies for a final assault, but heavy rain reduced air support and ended the battle. The 3,187th Battalion once again had to retreat down the mountain. 3 companies of the 1,506th Battalion fought to capture High Point 900, south of the summit, but faced strong resistance. Due to heavy casualties over a week and pressure from unwanted media attention, some commanders seriously considered halting the attacks. Both the Corps commander and MACV commander, General Creighton W. Abrams, publicly supported this decision. However, the field commanders felt humiliated to withdraw against a much smaller enemy force. Thus, Zay decided to continue the attack. Teep Toop Dao. After a week of fighting, the 2 battalions of the People's Liberation Armed Forces of South Vietnam had achieved their objective of inflicting significant casualties on the American forces. Following their general strategy in battles with the Americans, the People's Liberation Armed Forces of South Vietnam did not attempt to hold territory but focused on maximizing enemy casualties before retreating to avoid being encircled and destroyed by the superior firepower and mobility of the Americans. The initial plan was to withdraw on the night of the 17th, but the units performed well and extended their hold for another day. On the night of the 18th, the People's Liberation Armed Forces of South Vietnam began to withdraw from the Abia Mountain battlefield, leaving a small force behind as a diversion. On May 19, two American infantry battalions were airlifted to landing zones northeast and southeast of the mountain. Both battalions immediately moved up the mountain to positions from which they would launch their attack the next morning. Meanwhile, the 1506th Battalion spent the third consecutive day securing High Point 900. The 3rd Brigade launched its 4 battalions in an attack at 10 a.m. on May 20, including 2 companies of the 3 187th Battalion reinforced by Alpha Company of the 2 506th Battalion. The attacks were supported by 2 hours of airstrikes and 90 minutes of artillery bombardment. The battalions attacked simultaneously, and by 12 p.m., the 3 187th Battalion had reached the summit. The small diversionary unit of the People's Liberation Armed Forces of South Vietnam, after engaging the Americans, withdrew to Laos along with the main force, and Hill 937 was secured by the Americans by 5 p.m. During the 10 days of fighting, the U.S. military suffered 72 killed and 372 wounded, with several helicopters shot down or damaged. The U.S. claimed that the 7th and 8th Battalions of the 29th Regiment of the People's Liberation Armed Forces of South Vietnam suffered 630 fatalities, excluding the wounded, during the battle. This figure was highly contested and considered exaggerated, as the U.S. forces could not accurately count the number of Vietnamese casualties in the challenging battlefield conditions, mountainous terrain, heavy artillery, and air bombardments making observation difficult, and the Vietnamese infantry often hiding in well-concealed bunkers. In reality, the U.S. forces only captured 89 personal weapons and 22 crew-served weapons from the People's Liberation Armed Forces of South Vietnam, only about 1/6 of the number of Vietnamese casualties claimed by the U.S. The U.S. suffered hundreds of casualties but ultimately only captured a hill with no strategic military value. Major General John M. Wright quietly ordered a withdrawal from the hill on June 5. Debates about Hamburger Hill erupted in the U.S. Congress, with severe criticisms from Senators Edward Kennedy, George McGovern, and Stephen M. Young. Edward Kennedy called it a senseless and irresponsible operation. The lives of American soldiers were squandered for the military vanity of commanders. On May 25, 1969, the U.S. press referred to Abia as Hamburger Hill, condemning the military for sending troops into the Abia mountain area only to turn the Apache Snow operation into blood on the mountain. In its June 27 issue, Life magazine published photos of 241 American soldiers killed in 1 week in Vietnam, marking a turning point in the war. Although only a portion of these were casualties from Hamburger Hill, many Americans perceived that all the dead were victims of this senseless and insane battle. The controversy over the battle led to a reassessment of U.S. strategy in South Vietnam. As a direct result, to keep casualties from escalating, General Abrams halted the maximum pressure policy against the People's Liberation Armed Forces of South Vietnam, while President Richard Nixon accelerated the implementation of the Vietnamization strategy and announced the first withdrawal of expeditionary forces. Although the battle was only at the battalion level, it became a turning point in the Vietnam War. For the People's Liberation Armed Forces of South Vietnam, the results of the battle at Abia and the counteroffensive operations of the 324th Division in the A Luoi Valley encouraged and promoted the pacification movement developing in various localities. The victory at Abia entered the first traditional chapter of the 324th Division since its reorganization and marked the beginning of a phase of restoring the strategic position in the lowlands, re-establishing the 3 strategic areas after the Tet Offensive of 1968.